how do you explain the fact that we make ethical judgments, that we have ethics? What is its origins? And that's, in a way, a scientific question. It's, just as you might say, well, what's the origins of the fact that we have a certain anatomy, that we have hands with opposable thumbs and so on, and you can give an evolutionary explanation as to why that was useful and why we've evolved in the same way. So the question of why we have ethics can be treated in that way. And, not surprisingly, you can have an evolutionary explanation. And I think the best explanations of the origins of ethics are evolutionary ones. That is, that we have evolved as social mammals, more distinctively as social primates. And if we look at primate behaviour, we find inhibitions in behaviour which to some extent, and patterns of behaviour which to some extent correspond to our own. So that we find, for instance, obviously, mammals caring for their offspring. That's something that we do and we regard as fundamental to ethics, that parents care for their offspring. We also find in a number of social mammals something very like the principle of reciprocity. That is, if one among the group does a favour to another, they expect that favour to be repaid. And if the favour is not repaid, they get angry. You can find many examples of that among scientists who observe primates. Frans de Waal, for example, is a famous primatologist who's observed chimpanzees and other primates for many years. Recounts an incident where one chimpanzee, he gives them names, but I don't remember the names, but let's say Bill is attacked by Jack, and Fred comes to help Bill when Bill is attacked by Jack. And then later on, after that has been, that dispute has been resolved and Jack has been fought off by the combined forces of Bill and Fred, later on Jack attacks Fred. And Fred gestures to Bill to come and help, but Bill does nothing. So Fred has a tough time of it, trying to fight off Jack alone, but eventually that's resolved. And what does Fred do then? He goes over and attacks Bill. Right? He's obviously saying, well, what's the matter with you? I helped you, and you didn't help me back in similar circumstances. And you can find lots of examples of that kind of behaviour. Also, things like grooming each other, finding parasites and removing those, and things like that. If one does it, the other expects it back. So when you think about it, that's clearly analogous to our conceptions of fairness and justice. That we think that repaying favours is an important part of fairness, that it's unfair not to repay them. And what you could say is we have developed a whole set of kind of complex moral rules, moral principles, which derives from that. Of course, we, unlike chimpanzees and other primates, we use a complicated language. We talk about these things a lot. Even some humans anyway have written languages and write them down. Others develop oral codes and oral traditions. So, of course, we take these things further. And people might say, well, you can't talk about morality among animals because they don't understand the basic principles of morality. They don't choose in the same way to follow morality. But I think what you can say is that we can clearly see the origins of morality, the prototype of morality in our close primate relatives. And what we have done using our capacity of reason is to elaborate on that, develop it, certainly. But if you want to say what are the origins of morality, I think they clearly come from our early human and even pre-human existence as social beings. So that tells us where it comes from, but of course it doesn't tell us what principles we ought to adopt. Philosophers often talk about what they call the gap between is and ought. sometimes also referred to as the naturalistic fallacy. The fallacy of saying, for example, something is natural, therefore you ought to do it. And so I agree, I think this is a fallacy, and you can't argue from the fact that primates did this and early humans did this to the fact that we ought to do it. There may well be some things that are quite natural to us that we ought not to do. For example, you could argue that one of the behaviours that we find in some of our pre-human relatives, like chimpanzees, is warfare. Jane Goodall observed that groups of chimpanzees sometimes would attack neighbouring groups, particularly some of the young males would go out and kill neighbouring groups, kill members of neighbouring groups when they could find them. And of course we have done that throughout our history, and as we know from the archaeological records from prehistory as well. But that doesn't mean that we think that war is all right or is good just because it's natural. So we can't argue from the origins to what we ought to be doing. For that we have to think about our own views and our own principles. And this is where things get more difficult, because there's a long-standing difference of opinions in philosophers as to whether in fact we can, by the use of our reason, derive some moral principles, which are sort of universally true moral principles, or whether, on the other hand, morality is going to be just something that is subjective, where everybody has their own morality, or perhaps groups have their own morality, and there's no real way of deciding between them. And I think that that's a difficult question and an open question. Some great philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, have tried to use reason to derive a set of moral principles. Most philosophers probably think that Kant did not succeed in that attempt. There have been a range of other attempts that I can't go into. But it's still possible to argue that we can use reason to work out what is the right thing to do, and that in fact we might say, well, what ethics tells us to do is to put ourselves in the position of others and take on the desires that others have. And if we do that, then in some way we get to the view that everybody's interests count equally, and what we ought to do is to maximize the satisfaction of interests of everyone affected by our actions. That's a kind of utilitarianism, which is in fact a position that I would defend, although I would hesitate to say that we can prove it as somehow the one true moral position. Because there are a range of other options, and where you get down, perhaps in the end, to sort of fundamental choices as to whether you think maximizing the satisfaction of interests or happiness is more important, or some principle of justice about how interests should be distributed, or some principle of respect for some set of basic rights. Many of these are plausible moral views, and I think you could find reasons for defending any of them. And I certainly don't have time tonight to try to go into that topic more fully. So that's why, as I say, there is some difficulty in saying what the basis of ethics is, and in saying that you have one absolute set of ethical principles. On the other hand, I do think it's true that reason has a role to play in ethics, and that you can show that some ethical views are actually inconsistent or incoherent, and you can reject those. And I'll say a little bit about that before I finish. So I don't think it's true that just anything goes in ethics, that anyone's opinion is as good as anyone else's opinion, and that ethics is purely subjective. I do think there's this significant role for reason and argument.